There's a war in American history that most Americans have never heard of, a war that killed more than 200,000 people, a war that turned the United States into a colonial empire, and a war that's barely mentioned in most school textbooks. It's called the Philippine-American War, and it happened between 1899 and 1902, though fighting continued in some areas until 1913. This wasn't a small conflict. American soldiers fought for years in a brutal counterinsurgency campaign halfway around the world. They burned villages, tortured prisoners, and implemented policies that led to mass starvation and disease. And on the other side, Filipino fighters who had just won their independence from Spain found themselves fighting a new colonial power, one that had promised to support their freedom and then took it away. This is the story of how America acquired the Philippines, why that acquisition led to a devastating war, and why you probably never learned about it in school. The whole thing started with a different war, the Spanish-American War of 1898. Most Americans know something about that conflict, or at least they've heard the phrase, "Remember the Maine." On February 15, 1898, the USS Maine, an American battleship, exploded in Havana Harbor in Cuba, killing 266 sailors. Nobody really knew what caused the explosion. Modern investigations suggest it was probably an accident, a fire in a coal bunker that ignited the ammunition magazines. But in 1898, American newspapers didn't wait for facts. Publishers like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer were in the middle of a circulation war, competing to sell more papers, and they knew that sensational stories sold. They blamed Spain, which controlled Cuba at the time, and launched a propaganda campaign that whipped Americans into a war frenzy. "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," became the slogan that echoed across the country. President William McKinley didn't really want war. He was a Civil War veteran who had seen combat firsthand and knew what war actually meant. But the pressure from the press, from business interests who wanted to protect their investments in Cuban sugar, and from an American public that had been fed a steady diet of atrocity stories about Spanish rule in Cuba, became overwhelming. In April 1898, McKinley asked Congress for authorization to use military force, and Congress gave it to him. The Spanish-American War had begun. But here's what most history classes skip over. The war wasn't just about Cuba. American leaders had been eyeing Spain's colonial empire for years, and they saw the conflict as an opportunity to expand American power across two oceans. Theodore Roosevelt, who was Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time, had been planning for war with Spain for months. He had a particular interest in the Philippines, a Spanish colony in the Western Pacific that consisted of more than 7,000 islands. Roosevelt and other expansionists saw the Philippines as a strategic prize, a naval base that would make America a power in Asia and a gateway to the supposedly unlimited markets of China. Before war was even declared, Roosevelt sent secret orders to Commodore George Dewey, who commanded the U.S. Navy's Asiatic Squadron stationed in Hong Kong. The orders were simple. If war came, Dewey was to immediately sail to the Philippines and destroy the Spanish fleet there. When war was declared in late April, Dewey did exactly that. On May 1, 1898, his squadron steamed into Manila Bay at dawn and caught the Spanish fleet completely unprepared. The battle was hardly a battle at all. The Spanish ships were old, their crews were undermanned, and they had no chance against modern American warships. In about 7 hours, Dewey sank or destroyed every Spanish vessel without losing a single American life. It was a stunning victory that made Dewey a national hero and gave the United States control of Manila Bay. But there's a crucial part of this story that gets left out of most textbooks. The Filipinos had been fighting for their independence from Spain long before America showed up. This wasn't a primitive people waiting to be liberated by Americans. The Philippines had a sophisticated independence movement led by educated, politically savvy leaders who had been organizing resistance to Spanish colonial rule for decades. The most important figure in this movement was José Rizal, a doctor who had studied in Europe and spoke multiple languages. Rizal wrote novels that exposed the corruption and brutality of Spanish colonial rule. He didn't advocate violence. He believed in reform through education and peaceful political change. But the Spanish authorities saw his writings as dangerous, and in December 1896, they arrested him and executed him by firing squad in Manila. His death didn't stop the independence movement, it supercharged it. Rizal became a martyr, and his execution sparked a full-scale revolution. The military leader of that revolution was Emilio Aguinaldo, a 29-year-old man from a wealthy family in Cavite province. Aguinaldo proved to be a talented military commander. By early 1897, his revolutionary forces controlled significant parts of Luzon, the main Philippine island. The Spanish couldn't crush the rebellion, so they negotiated. They paid Aguinaldo and his top commanders 400,000 pesos and promised reforms in exchange for going into exile in Hong Kong. Aguinaldo took the deal, but he didn't give up. He used the money to buy weapons and waited for another chance. That chance came when the Americans arrived. After Dewey's victory in Manila Bay, American officials in Hong Kong contacted Aguinaldo. The exact details of what was promised in these meetings remain disputed to this day, but Aguinaldo later testified that American officials told him the United States would support Philippine independence. They pointed out that America was fighting to free Cuba from Spanish rule. They reminded him that America itself had been a colony that fought for independence. They said America didn't want colonies, just wanted to help the Filipino people achieve freedom. Whether these promises had official authorization or were just individual officials speaking without authority remains unclear, but Aguinaldo believed them. In May 1898, he returned to the Philippines on an American ship. What happened next showed just how capable the Filipino revolutionaries really were. Aguinaldo's forces swept across the Philippines like wildfire. They defeated Spanish garrisons, liberated towns, and within weeks controlled almost the entire archipelago except for Manila itself. On June 12, 1898, Aguinaldo declared Philippine independence. His government wrote a constitution based partly on the U.S. Constitution. They established a democratic republic with an elected legislature. They created a flag, a national anthem, and all the institutions of a sovereign nation. By late summer 1898, the Philippines had achieved its independence from Spain. Spanish forces were trapped in Manila, surrounded by Filipino troops who had defeated them. American soldiers didn't start arriving in significant numbers until July and August 1898. By the time they got there, the fighting was essentially over. The Filipinos had won, but the Americans weren't there to help the Philippines become independent. They were there to take control. In August, American and Spanish commanders staged what can only be described as a fake battle. They secretly negotiated terms where the Spanish would put up token resistance and then surrender Manila to the Americans, not to the Filipinos. The Spanish were terrified of what might happen if they surrendered to the Filipinos after 300 years of colonial oppression. They preferred to surrender to fellow Europeans, fellow Catholics, people they saw as civilized. So on August 13, 1898, American troops marched into Manila while Filipino forces, the people who had actually defeated the Spanish, were kept outside the city walls. Here's a detail that makes this even more outrageous. The Battle of Manila happened the day after Spain and the United States had signed a preliminary peace agreement ending the war. Both the Americans and the Spanish knew the war was over, but they staged the battle anyway because they wanted the Americans to control Manila, and neither side bothered to tell the Filipinos that the war had already ended. This should have been the moment when Aguinaldo realized something was seriously wrong, but he still held out hope that American promises of support for independence were genuine. Back in the United States, a massive debate was raging about what to do with the Philippines. The country was deeply split. The pro-imperialist faction, led by Theodore Roosevelt, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, and eventually supported by President McKinley, argued that America had a duty to take the Philippines. They used language that sounds shocking today but was common then. They talked about the white man's burden, about America's obligation to civilize and Christianize the Filipinos. This argument was particularly absurd because the Philippines had been Catholic for over 300 years. Manila had universities that were older than Harvard. The Filipino educated class spoke Spanish, and many spoke English. But these facts didn't matter to American imperialists who saw Filipinos as racially inferior and incapable of self-government. They also made strategic arguments. They said the Philippines would be a valuable naval base and a gateway to Asian markets. They warned that if America didn't take the Philippines, Germany or Japan would. They argued that America needed to become a world power, and world powers had colonies. It was about prestige, about proving that America could compete with European empires, about taking what they saw as America's rightful place on the world stage. On the other side were the anti-imperialists, and this was a fascinating coalition. It included Mark Twain, one of America's most famous writers. It included Andrew Carnegie, one of the richest men in America. It included former President Grover Cleveland, Labor leader Samuel Gompers, and philosophers like William James. These people argued that imperialism betrayed everything America stood for. They said a republic couldn't hold colonies without ceasing to be a republic. They pointed out that the Declaration of Independence said all men are created equal and have the right to self-government. They argued that conquering the Philippines would be expensive and bloody. And they said, quite simply, that the Filipinos had a right to govern themselves. Mark Twain was particularly savage in his criticism. He wrote that the American flag should have its white stripes painted black and its stars replaced with skull and crossbones. He said that instead of the traditional flag, America should adopt a new one appropriate for its new role as a conquering power. Andrew Carnegie was so opposed to American imperialism that he offered to personally write a check for $20 million to buy the Philippines from the U.S. government and immediately grant them independence. He was willing to pay out of his own pocket just to prevent America from becoming a colonial empire. President McKinley struggled with the decision. He later told a group of Methodist ministers that he walked the floors of the White House night after night, praying for guidance about what to do with the Philippines. His explanation of how he reached his decision is revealing. He said he realized that giving the Philippines back to Spain would be cowardly and dishonorable. Giving them to France or Germany would be bad business. Leaving them to govern themselves would lead to anarchy and chaos. So there was nothing left to do, he said, but to take all the Philippines, educate the Filipinos, uplift them, civilize them, and Christianize them, and by God's grace do the very best by them as fellow men for whom Christ also died. The patronizing arrogance of this statement, the complete ignorance it displayed about Filipino society and history, shows how American leaders viewed the people whose fate they were deciding. In December 1898, Spain and the United States signed the Treaty of Paris, officially ending the Spanish-American War. The terms were straightforward. Spain gave Cuba its independence, though it would be a deeply compromised independence, with American troops occupying the island and American companies dominating its economy. Spain ceded Puerto Rico and Guam directly to the United States, and Spain sold the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. Let that sink in. Spain sold 7,000 islands and 7 million people to America for $20 million. The Filipinos weren't consulted. They weren't invited to the negotiations. They weren't even informed until after the deal was done. Spain sold something they no longer controlled, and America bought something that didn't belong to Spain in the first place. The treaty needed to be ratified by the U.S. Senate, where it needed a 2/3 majority. The vote was incredibly close. It passed 57 to 27, just one vote more than required. Some anti-imperialist senators held their noses and voted yes, because they wanted to formally end the war with Spain, thinking they could grant the Philippines independence later through separate legislation. It was one of the most consequential votes in American history, the moment when the United States officially became an overseas colonial empire. In the Philippines, Aguinaldo and his government watched all this with growing fury and disbelief. They had declared independence. They had defeated Spain. They controlled virtually the entire country except for the areas where American troops were stationed. And now they were being told they had been sold, that America owned them, that their independence didn't matter. Tensions between American and Filipino forces escalated throughout late 1898 and early 1899. They faced each other across increasingly hostile lines around Manila. American soldiers, many of them volunteers from Western states, treated Filipinos with open contempt and racism. They used the same slurs they used for Native Americans and African Americans. They couldn't understand why these people didn't want American rule, which they saw as obviously superior to Spanish rule. On the night of February 4, 1899, the shooting started. The exact details are disputed. An American patrol encountered Filipino soldiers near the San Juan Bridge on the outskirts of Manila. There was a confrontation. Someone fired. Within minutes, both sides were shooting at each other. Within hours, fighting spread along the entire perimeter. The next morning, American forces launched a major offensive, driving back Filipino positions with overwhelming firepower. The Philippine-American War had begun. The U.S. government refused to call it a war. They called it an insurrection, a rebellion, a pacification campaign. This language was deliberate. Calling it a war would mean recognizing the Philippine government as a legitimate belligerent, which would undermine America's claim that the Philippines belonged to the United States. So officially, Aguinaldo's soldiers weren't enemy combatants, they were insurgents rebelling against lawful American authority. This linguistic distinction had real consequences. It meant that international laws of war didn't fully apply, which gave American forces more latitude in how they conducted operations. The first phase of the war was conventional military combat, and the Americans won easily. The U.S. Army had better everything: better rifles, better artillery, better logistics, better training. Aguinaldo's forces fought bravely, and they had the advantage of knowing the terrain and having popular support, but they were outgunned. American forces pushed north from Manila, won battle after battle, captured the revolutionary capital at Malolos, and drove Aguinaldo's army into the mountains of northern Luzon. But defeating the Filipino army in conventional battles didn't end the war. It just transformed it into something much more difficult and brutal. The Filipinos shifted to guerrilla warfare. Instead of facing American forces in open battle, they ambushed patrols, attacked supply lines, struck isolated garrisons, and then disappeared into the countryside. The Filipino people supported the guerrillas by providing food, shelter, information, and recruits. This is classic insurgent warfare, and American forces had no good answer for it. The American response was to adopt increasingly harsh measures. If the guerrillas were hiding among the civilian population, then the solution was to control the civilian population. This led to a strategy that's familiar to anyone who has studied counterinsurgency warfare. American forces began implementing policies that essentially punished the entire Filipino population for supporting the guerrillas. The most notorious of these policies was reconcentration, which the Spanish had used in Cuba and which Americans had denounced as barbaric when Spain did it. The Americans took Filipino civilians in contested areas and forced them into designated concentration zones. Anyone found outside these zones could be assumed to be a guerrilla or guerrilla supporter and could be shot on sight. Fields were burned. Livestock was killed. Food stores were destroyed. The goal was to create a wasteland where guerrillas couldn't survive because there was no food and no support from the local population. The results were catastrophic. The concentration camps were overcrowded, unsanitary, and desperately short of food. Diseases like cholera, malaria, and dysentery swept through them. Thousands died from starvation and disease. Entire villages disappeared. The American strategy was essentially to destroy Filipino society in contested areas to make it impossible for guerrillas to operate. American soldiers also routinely used torture to extract information. The most common method was called the water cure, and it's exactly what we now call waterboarding. Prisoners or suspects would be held down, their mouths forced open, and water poured down their throats until their stomachs swelled. Then soldiers would beat or jump on the person's stomach, forcing the water out, often with blood. Then they'd repeat the process. The goal was to get information about guerrilla movements or weapons caches, but it was also used as punishment or just as sadistic entertainment. Soldiers wrote letters home describing the water cure casually as just another part of the day's work. There were also massacres and atrocities that went beyond even the harsh policies. One of the most infamous incidents happened in September 1901 in the town of Balangiga on Samar Island. Filipino guerrillas carried out a surprise attack on an American garrison during breakfast, killing 48 soldiers. It was one of the worst American defeats of the war. The U.S. military's response was systematic devastation. General Jacob Smith was put in charge of operations on Samar, and his orders were explicit. He wanted Samar turned into a howling wilderness. He told his officers to kill and burn, and said the more they killed and burned, the better pleased he would be. When asked about the age limit for killing, Smith reportedly said 10 years and up. His subordinate, Major Littleton Waller, carried out these orders with thoroughness. Villages across Samar were burned, crops were destroyed, civilians were killed. The exact death toll on Samar alone is unknown, but it was in the thousands. Church bells that had been cast centuries ago were stolen from Filipino churches and sent back to American towns as war trophies. You can still find them today in various places across the United States. Wounded Filipino soldiers were shot where they lay. Prisoners were executed. Entire villages suspected of supporting guerrillas were wiped out. American soldiers wrote letters home describing these actions with shocking casualness. One soldier wrote that they had orders to take no prisoners, to kill everything that moved. Another wrote that the Filipino people needed to be exterminated to make room for Americans to settle the islands. Were these official policies? Not exactly. The official rules said prisoners should be treated humanely and civilians should be protected. But there was a huge gap between what the rules said on paper and what actually happened in the field. Officers often looked the other way. Some actively encouraged brutality, and the racial attitudes of the time made it easy for American soldiers to dehumanize Filipinos and treat them with shocking cruelty. The soldiers saw Filipinos as savages, as barely human, as people who didn't deserve the same treatment as white people. News of these atrocities began filtering back to the United States. Anti-imperialist groups seized on them. Newspapers published letters from soldiers. Veterans testified before Congress about what they had seen and done. There were military trials. General Jacob Smith was court-martialed and found guilty, but his punishment was just forced retirement. No jail time, no real consequences. There were congressional investigations, public debates, and moral outrage from some quarters. But most Americans didn't really care, or didn't care enough to demand change. The war was far away. The casualties were mostly Filipino, and racial attitudes made it easy to dismiss their suffering. American casualties were relatively light. More American soldiers died from disease than from combat. The war didn't dominate headlines the way the Spanish-American War had. It became a grinding counterinsurgency campaign that most Americans were only vaguely aware of. The death toll was staggering. The U.S. military reported about 4,200 American soldiers killed. They claim to have killed about 20,000 Filipino combatants, but these numbers don't come close to capturing the full horror. The civilian death toll was enormous. Conservative estimates put it at 200,000. More recent scholarship suggests it might have been as high as 750,000 or even 1 million when you include deaths from war-related famine and disease. The Philippine population actually declined during these years, something that only happens during truly devastating conflicts. Think about what 200,000 deaths meant in context. The Philippines had maybe 7 or 8 million people. Losing 200,000 represents roughly 2 to 3% of the entire population killed in just a few years. To put that in perspective, if the United States today experienced casualties at the same rate, it would mean 6 to 10 million dead. That's the scale of devastation this war inflicted. The war continued for years. The conventional phase lasted until March 1901, when American forces captured Aguinaldo through a clever intelligence operation. They intercepted a message, located his hideout in northern Luzon, and sent a small force disguised as prisoners to infiltrate his camp. They captured him without a fight. In captivity, Aguinaldo issued a proclamation calling on his followers to accept American sovereignty. Many did, but fighting continued in various parts of the archipelago. The war officially ended on July 4, 1902, when President Theodore Roosevelt declared victory, but fighting in the Muslim South continued until 1913. So what did America gain from all this? The Philippines became an American colony, though the U.S. preferred terms like territory or insular possession. A colonial government was established with an American governor-general. Americans controlled all the key positions. The U.S. built schools and introduced English as the language of instruction, creating a Filipino elite educated in American language and culture. American companies invested in Philippine agriculture and resources. The U.S. got its naval base in Manila. America became a Pacific power with colonies in the Philippines, Hawaii, Guam, and American Samoa. But the costs were enormous. The war cost hundreds of millions of dollars. It cost thousands of American lives. It cost hundreds of thousands of Filipino lives. It sparked a fierce domestic debate that revealed deep divisions in American society. And it established patterns of American intervention, of counterinsurgency warfare, of torture and harsh tactics that would be repeated in future conflicts. Now here's the crucial question. Why don't American schools teach this? Why do most Americans graduate from high school without ever hearing about the Philippine-American War? The Spanish-American War gets mentioned, usually briefly. Students learn about Remember the Maine and Teddy Roosevelt charging up San Juan Hill. But the Philippine-American War, which was much longer, much more violent, and much more significant in terms of American history, is barely mentioned or completely ignored. There are several reasons for this omission, and they're all revealing. First, the Philippine-American War doesn't fit comfortably into the narrative that American schools typically teach about U.S. history. That narrative emphasizes American exceptionalism, the idea that America is different from other nations, that American power is benevolent, that America stands for freedom and democracy. The Philippine-American War contradicts all of that. It's a story of American imperialism, of conquest, of brutal suppression, of an independence movement. It's hard to square that with the story of America as a force for good in the world. Second, the war raises uncomfortable questions about race. American soldiers used the same tactics and the same racist language in the Philippines that were being used to oppress African Americans at home. The war happened at the exact same time as the height of lynching in the American South, as Jim Crow laws were being passed to disenfranchise black voters, as the Supreme Court was upholding segregation in Plessy v. Ferguson. The connection between domestic racism and imperial racism abroad is clear, but it's not something that fits easily into standard curriculum narratives. Third, teaching about the Philippine-American War would require teaching about American atrocities. It would require discussing torture, massacres, concentration camps, and systematic destruction of civilian areas. These are uncomfortable topics. Teachers worry about how to present them to students. School boards worry about community reactions. It's easier to just skip over the whole thing. Fourth, the war is complicated. It doesn't have clear good guys and bad guys in the way that World War II does. It requires understanding colonialism, imperialism, nationalism, and insurgency. It requires looking at American actions critically. It requires acknowledging that the United States can act as an imperial power that suppresses other people's independence. This complexity makes it difficult to fit into the simplified narratives that often characterize high school history curricula. Fifth, there's simply a lack of emphasis on it in standardized curricula and textbooks. History textbooks are already trying to cover an enormous amount of material, and they tend to focus on what they consider the most important events. The Spanish-American War gets included because it's seen as marking America's emergence as a world power. The Philippine-American War gets reduced to a footnote or left out entirely because it's seen as a minor colonial conflict. The fact that it killed hundreds of thousands of people and had huge consequences for both American and Philippine history doesn't seem to matter to textbook authors and curriculum designers. Sixth, there's been a deliberate historical amnesia about American imperialism. After World War II, when colonialism became internationally unacceptable and former colonies gained independence, the United States positioned itself as an anti-colonial power opposed to European imperialism. American leaders and historians often downplayed or ignored America's own colonial adventures. The Philippines got independence in 1946, and it became convenient to forget about the ugly history of how America acquired the islands in the first place. Finally, the Philippine-American community in the United States, which now numbers in the millions, has had complicated feelings about highlighting this history. On one hand, it's an important part of Philippine national identity. On the other hand, many Filipino-Americans have family connections to the United States that go back to the colonial period, have relatives who served in the U.S. military, and have benefited from American education and economic opportunities. Pushing too hard on the atrocities of the war risks creating awkward tensions. The result of all these factors is that the Philippine-American War has largely disappeared from American historical consciousness. It's not a conspiracy exactly. It's more a collective forgetting, a decision by textbook authors, curriculum designers, teachers, and the broader culture that this particular piece of history isn't important enough to teach, and that forgetting itself is significant. It shows how history gets shaped by present concerns, how uncomfortable truths get buried, how the stories we tell about our past serve purposes in the present. But there are consequences to this forgetting. For one thing, it means Americans don't understand how the United States became a Pacific power. The U.S. military presence in Asia, the alliances and partnerships, the entire structure of American influence in the Pacific has roots in the conquest of the Philippines. Understanding that history helps explain the present. More importantly, the Philippine-American War established patterns that would be repeated throughout American history. The counterinsurgency tactics used in the Philippines would be used again in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. The difficulty of fighting guerrillas who hide among a supportive population, the temptation to use harsh tactics against civilians, the use of torture to extract intelligence, the frustration of fighting an enemy who won't stand and fight conventional battles, all of this was present in the Philippines and would be present in later conflicts. If the Philippine-American War were taught, maybe Americans would better understand these later conflicts. The war also shows the costs of ignoring or suppressing nationalism and independence movements. Aguinaldo and the Filipino revolutionaries weren't terrorists or bandits. They were nationalists fighting for independence. They had legitimate grievances. They had established a government and declared independence. The United States chose to suppress that independence movement by force, and the result was years of brutal warfare. This pattern would repeat in Vietnam, where the US fought against Vietnamese nationalists who wanted independence from colonial rule. Understanding the Philippine-American War might have helped Americans understand Vietnam. The war also shows what happens when racist attitudes shape policy. American soldiers and politicians saw Filipinos as racially inferior, as incapable of self-government, as savages who needed to be civilized. These attitudes made atrocities possible and made them acceptable to the American public. If we don't teach about the Philippine-American War and the role racism played in it, we can't fully understand how racism has shaped American foreign policy and military actions. There's also the simple matter of historical truth. The Philippine-American War happened. It killed hundreds of thousands of people. It transformed both the United States and the Philippines. Pretending it didn't happen or treating it as an unimportant footnote is a form of historical dishonesty. History education should help students understand what actually happened, not just provide a sanitized narrative that makes us feel good about our country. Some people might argue that teaching about American atrocities in the Philippines would be unpatriotic, that it would make students hate America or lose faith in their country. This argument fundamentally misunderstands both patriotism and education. Real patriotism means caring enough about your country to understand its full history, including the ugly parts. It means wanting your country to learn from its mistakes rather than repeat them. And education isn't about indoctrination or making students feel a certain way about their country. It's about helping them understand history in its complexity, with all its contradictions and complications. Teaching about the Philippine-American War doesn't require condemning America or presenting a one-sided story. It's entirely possible to teach the war in a way that acknowledges multiple perspectives, that explains why American leaders made the decisions they did, that recognizes the genuine belief many Americans had that they were helping the Filipinos, while still being honest about what actually happened and what the consequences were. Students are capable of understanding moral complexity. They can handle the idea that their country has sometimes acted in ways that contradict its stated values. In fact, not teaching the Philippine-American War does students a disservice. It leaves them unprepared to understand American foreign policy, unable to recognize patterns in American military interventions, and ignorant of a major chapter in their own history. It also means that when they do eventually learn about the war, perhaps in college or through their own reading, they may feel betrayed by their earlier education, by the fact that something so significant was hidden from them. The war also has ongoing relevance. The relationship between the United States and the Philippines, the presence of millions of Filipino Americans in the United States, the military alliance between the two countries, all of these have roots in the colonial relationship established through the war. Understanding that history helps make sense of the present. Moreover, the debates that Americans had about imperialism in 1898 and 1899 are relevant to debates today. When should the United States intervene in other countries? What are America's responsibilities to people in other nations? How should America balance its interests with its values? What are the costs of empire, even informal empire? These questions that animated the debate between imperialists and anti-imperialists in 1898 are still live questions today. The military tactics and counterinsurgency strategies used in the Philippines have modern parallels that are hard to ignore. The water cure used on Filipino prisoners is what we call waterboarding, a technique that was used by the CIA in the War on Terror. The debate about whether waterboarding constitutes torture echoes debates from over a century ago. The concentration camps used in the Philippines have parallels to strategic Hamlet programs in Vietnam and the treatment of civilians in Iraq and Afghanistan. The difficulty of distinguishing between combatants and civilians, of fighting an insurgency that has popular support, of conducting counterinsurgency operations in a foreign culture, all the challenges American forces faced in the Philippines have reappeared in every subsequent counterinsurgency campaign America has fought. If the Philippine-American War were properly taught, Americans might be better equipped to evaluate these modern conflicts. They might recognize patterns. They might ask harder questions about the likely outcomes. They might be more skeptical of claims that insurgencies can be quickly and easily suppressed. They might better understand the long-term costs of military interventions in other countries. The war also offers lessons about the importance of self-determination and the dangers of dismissing nationalist movements. The Filipino independence movement was real, was legitimate, and had genuine popular support. American leaders dismissed it as the work of a small elite, as a movement that didn't represent ordinary Filipinos. They were wrong. The strength and duration of Filipino resistance showed that the independence movement had deep roots. Similar mistakes would be made in Vietnam, where American leaders underestimated the strength of Vietnamese nationalism. There's also the fundamental question of honesty about American history. Every nation has aspects of its history that are uncomfortable or shameful. The question is whether the nation is willing to confront those aspects honestly or whether it prefers comfortable myths. Germany has confronted the Holocaust. South Africa has confronted apartheid. These confrontations have been painful, but they've been necessary for moving forward. The United States has made some progress in confronting uncomfortable aspects of its history, like slavery and the treatment of Native Americans, though there's still a long way to go. But the Philippine-American War remains largely unconfronted, a piece of history that most Americans simply don't know about. This forgetting also does a disservice to the Filipino people who fought and died in the war. They were patriots fighting for their country's independence. They deserve to be remembered. Their struggle deserves to be recognized. The hundreds of thousands of civilians who died deserve to have their deaths acknowledged. By not teaching the war, American schools essentially erase these people from history, treat them as unimportant, as not worth remembering. That's not just historical amnesia. It's a form of ongoing disrespect. The American soldiers who fought in the war also deserve better than to be forgotten. They were sent to fight a war most of them didn't understand, in a place they'd never heard of, for reasons that were never clearly explained. Some committed atrocities. Others tried to act honorably in a difficult situation. They came home to a country that quickly lost interest in the war and wanted to move on. They deserve to have their service and sacrifice remembered, even as we're honest about what that service involved. The war also reveals tensions in American identity that remain unresolved. Is America an empire or a republic? Can it be both? Does American power exist to spread American values, or does the pursuit of power inevitably compromise those values? These questions have never been fully answered, and they're obscured rather than illuminated by not teaching about the Philippine-American War. The war forces us to confront these questions directly because it's a case where American imperial ambitions and American democratic values came into direct conflict, and imperial ambitions won. In recent years, there's been some increased attention to the Philippine-American War in academic circles and in some educational materials. A few textbooks now include more substantial coverage. Some teachers have developed curricula that address the war in depth, but this remains the exception rather than the rule. The vast majority of American students still graduate from high school without having heard of the war or having only the vaguest awareness that something happened in the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. This needs to change. The Philippine-American War should be taught honestly, and should be taught as the major historical event it was. Students should learn about the Filipino independence movement and its leaders. They should learn about the debate between imperialists and anti-imperialists in America. They should learn about the course of the war and the tactics used by both sides. They should learn about the civilian casualties and the conditions that led to mass death from disease and starvation. They should learn about the atrocities, including the water cure and the reconcentration camps. They should learn about the aftermath and the establishment of American colonial rule. And they should be encouraged to think critically about what the war reveals about American power, American values, and the gap between the two. Teaching this history doesn't mean hating America. It means understanding America fully, with all its complexities and contradictions. It means recognizing that the United States, like every powerful nation in history, has sometimes acted in ways that contradict its stated principles. It means grappling with difficult moral questions about power, empire, and responsibility. And it means honoring the memory of the hundreds of thousands of Filipinos who died in a war that most Americans have never heard of. The Philippine-American War deserves to be remembered. The Filipinos who fought for independence deserve to be remembered. The civilians who died deserve to be remembered. And the lessons of the war about the costs of empire, about the persistence of nationalism, about the dangers of racism in foreign policy, about the brutality of counterinsurgency warfare, all of these lessons deserve to be learned. Not teaching the war isn't just a gap in education. It's a choice to forget, a choice to look away, a choice to tell a more comfortable story about America rather than the full truth. And that choice has consequences because those who don't know history really are doomed to repeat it.